To hear that as a starting point, and then we'll hear from Murray Leibbrandt. So let's start the video.
Hello, my name is Consuelo Boronat. I'm Director of Operational Analysis in the Office of Analysis and Information Management at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. I want to talk with you today about using data to increase university student success. At FIU, we define student success as retention and on-time graduation. Some key questions that we look at when we are trying to figure out how to increase student success is determining when we lose students and what are short-term and long-term ways to decrease dropout. Let me tell you a little bit about FIU, because you'll see that it bears some similarity to some of your institutions. FIU is a large metropolitan research university. We have over 54,000 students, and most of our students are minorities. 64% are Hispanic, so they could be white or black, 13% are black, 11% are white, and 3% are Asian. Most of our students are low income. 55% of them qualify for federal grants, which they do not need to repay, and these, along with even more students, qualify for federal loans. FIU is an urban institution. We're based in Miami, Florida, and our metropolitan area has a population of about 5.5 million people. We're also a Carnegie Very High Research Classification university. Several years ago, we started an initiative called the Graduation Success Initiative. My Office of Operational Analysis began because of this program. In the last several years, we have been able to contribute to our graduation rates increasing from 41% to 57% of students graduating on time from their degree programs. The components of the GSI are increased and improved academic advising, getting students into the appropriate majors or programs early on, removing unnecessary obstacles for students, providing supports for students, tutoring and so on, and identifying students at appropriate times to help them. There will be a paper coming out in September 2016 that details the GSI. You'll see a reference to it in the references section at the end. So why do students leave university? One thing we've seen is that there's not just one answer. There are different reasons for different students. Because of this, we need to identify key factors and work to improve these. And in particular, we need to identify subsets of students who are at risk because of these specific factors and reach out to them proactively. We may have one set of students who's at risk for one set of reasons, another subset for a different reason, and we need to find ways to help each of those subsets of students. In addition, part of what we've seen in my office is that sometimes there are really fairly simple, specific things that can flag a problem or help address a problem. For example, when we're talking about students who've attended their first semester of college, one way to know that some of those students are at risk is that we see that they do not register for the next semester when it comes time for them to register. Also, they may have failed a key course in their program. So, what we need to know is when we lose our students and why we lose them. I suggest that you look at comparing the students who leave from your institution with students who started at the same time but did not leave, and look at them on key variables. Look at them in terms of their performance in what you'll see I describe as critical courses. Also, what are their passing rates in their intended programs of study, and what are their GPAs? Do they have low GPAs? At our institutions, we see that students who have a low GPA become ineligible for financial aid after a certain point, and our students, as I suspect many of yours, cannot attend college without some form of financial aid. They're not from wealthy families. This graph that I'm showing you here will help you see how we look at when we lose students. In this chart, this first column simply refers to students' first semester of enrollment. And so almost 100% of those who started the first semester stayed that first semester. This next bar, the second bar, looks at their second year of enrollment. We see that 84% of our students returned from the first to their second year, but 15.5% dropped out. That 15.5% had an average GPA of 1.89 on a 4.0 scale, while the students who remained had a 2.93 average GPA on a 4.0 scale. In fact, the students who had not returned were below the required 2.0 GPA for financial aid. And so it could well be that because they did poorly academically, they lost their financial aid and were not able to afford to return. And in fact, other studies of ours have shown that to be the case. So we lost 15% this first year, between the first and second year. From the second to the third year, we've now lost 26.6%, here in the gray. So we lost an additional 11% compared to the previous year. Students who had lost by this point in time, by the beginning of their third year, had an average GPA of 2.02, which is quite a marginal GPA. In contrast, the students who were retained in the dark blue had an average 3.02 GPA, and we had retained almost 70% of them. By the time we reached the fourth year, we saw that we had lost 31.3% of our entering class, but not really very much more than we had lost by the second year. Those students had a 2.1 average GPA. The students who were retained, 41.5% of them had an average 2.89 GPA, and those who graduated, 27% of the class, had a 3.37 GPA. So this chart tells us a few things. First, we see that while we have a large number who leave after the first year, the number who leave after the second year is then smaller, and then it flattens out. We have relatively few students who drop out after the second year. The percentage of students who graduate increases year to year from 27% to almost 48% to 57%. And we see that they have high academic GPAs. So the students who are being successful are being more successful than the students who are simply remaining enrolled in school. But when we're wondering about when we lose students, we see that we really lose them from the first to the second year here and from the second to the third year. So what's happening in that time? Now, one thing we know is that some students we lose that first year are at risk before they begin. And we want to run analyses to see who they are and why. We also want to know in the analyses that we do they drop out after the first term, after the second term, and why? And because we see that they have low GPAs, are they failing specific classes that are high predictors of dropout? So it's this approach of systematically asking who and why and tying those predictors to specifically retention and graduation that we use to drive all of our analyses. All of our analyses in our office are focused on increasing retention and graduation rates. Let's think about intervening before students even started school. One thing that we've had some success with is creating a predictive model of which students are at risk. In our case, the best predictors that we found in our model were their high school GPA, as opposed to national tests, which I understand are much more common in South Africa, and the amount of unmet need. So high school GPA and amount of unmet need are key variables for us in identifying which incoming freshmen or incoming first-year students are at risk. In contrast, your models might focus on different variables: admission points, scores on NBTs, AQL achievement levels, and so on. These are all variables that let you know about students' academic preparation, just as high school GPA lets us know about academic preparation. of our students. In addition, in both of our cases, we know that our students, many of them, are not wealthy. So we want to know other key variables, such as whether or not students have loans, the amount of financial aid that they have, and so on. So academic preparation and access to financial resources are probably strong predictors of which of your students are at risk. However, the exact cutoffs of these will probably be different for each institution. And depending on the programs that your students are going into, their NBTs some of them may be more predictive than others. Models that you may want to consider would include the binary logistic regression, clustering models, and so on. In the resources and at the page at the end of this presentation, I will give you the citation for an internal report that we did here at FIU that you're welcome to get a copy of, and that will show you an example of a model that we created for identifying at-risk incoming freshmen. Let's talk about working with students who are at risk of dropout. One approach to working with these students is to do proactive academic advising. You don't want to wait for them to fail, because once they fail, it can be very difficult for them to recover from that failure. If your model shows you that you have incoming students who are at risk, you might think of creating a cohort program for them and giving it a positive name, something like an academic excellence program or the Panthers program, something like that. Don't label the program in such a way that would make it seem like a remedial or a developmental program. Students want to have pride, and they want to feel that they're part of something successful. A plan or a program such as this could provide peer tutoring, monthly meetings with advisors, group activities to give the students social support, to encourage them to study together, to help themselves academically, and to help them have peers who understand their situation when they're struggling. You may also want to examine your program admission criteria and course placement. Specifically, are the admission criteria for your different programs set well? I suggest that you look at the retention and graduation rates of students by their incoming scores on the assessments that they must take for entering different programs. Could your students who come in at the very bottom level of your placement scores have very low retention or graduation rates? If so, it's not clear that you are doing them a favor by admitting them to a program that they will fail from. So I would suggest either providing additional supports for those students, such as additional tutoring or advising, or perhaps changing your admissions criteria. It's something to consider. Also, what happens to students who fail in their programs? Do those students drop out, or are they quickly redirected to another program before they drop out? Our view is that it is better for students to get a degree than to get their first choice degree. If they, for example, are interested in accounting but are not academically successful in their courses, are they dropping out of university altogether, or are they being redirected to a different program that they're interested in and which they can perform in academically? I suggest you want them to get a degree, even if it's not the degree that they initially wanted. In addition, in hand with this, I would suggest you look at how you do course placement. For a number of years, we place students into our English 1 course based on their performance on a national test, the SAT, which would be comparable to one of your NBTs. However, when we looked at the correlations between performance on the placement test and students' performance in that class, we found that there was very little correlation between performance, passing rate on the test, passing rate in the course, and their score on the placement test. Instead, we found that for us, high school GPA was a better predictor of performance in their English 1 course. So I suggest that you look at the criteria that you're using for course placement to make sure it's the best criteria that you could use. In general, what we have found is that overall measures of students' academic ability are a better measure than, in some cases, narrower tests of their ability in terms of doing course placement. In addition, we have identified critical courses as an important predictor of which freshmen remain and which freshmen drop out. The graph on the screen shows the most failed courses at our university for freshmen. For example, finite math was the single most failed course, with over 700 students failing this course, out of about 4,000 who had started at that in that year. In fact, it had a 47% failure rate. And of those 47% of students who failed, 23% subsequently dropped out. So 23% of the 47%. And in this case, this equaled 170 students dropping out who had failed this course. Our next most failed course was college algebra, with a 45% failure rate and 26% of those dropping out who had failed it. But a large surprise for us was our English 1 course. Here we thought we were doing well because only 16% of the students failed this course. However, 46% of the students who failed this course subsequently dropped out. Almost half the students who failed the course dropped out. So we identified this course as a critical indicator. Performance in this course was a strong predictor of dropout. Another course that we were quite surprised to see on this list was our first-year experience course. This was simply a 1-credit extended orientation course, and we found that only 8% of students failed it. However, 47% of those who failed this relatively, in fact, very simple course dropped out. So we found that this course was really a motivation indicator. It let us know whether or not students were engaged with college and motivated to attend courses and be successful. So, when can you intervene with students who are doing academically poorly? If you have some type of alert system that your faculty can trigger during the semester that students are doing poorly in their courses, you can intervene early in the semester. Do faculty let you know if a student is not coming to class or if the student has failed their first exam? That can be important information for intervening with that student. Ideally, the faculty members will intervene with the students and let them know that there's tutoring available if it's available, or where they can get some assistance. It depends on the culture of the faculty in the department whether or not they do this. But if you get this information from faculty, then perhaps your student support or academic advisors can intervene with those students. You can also intervene after a semester or a term if the students have failed an important class, such as a critical indicator class like those we just saw, where failure is a strong predictor of dropout, or a course that's an important course in their major. You definitely want to intervene before students lose their financial aid, if possible. If they have to meet certain academic criteria to lose their aid, and you see after that first term that their GPAs are low, email those students, contact them, text them, let them know that they need to do better in order to keep their aid, and that there are resources available to help them at their institution. To intervene with students, you may try texting them, emailing them, or calling them, whatever works best with your students. Now, I'd like to give you some ideas that we have carried out of short-term and long-term ways to increase retention and graduation rates. In the short term, identify incoming students who are at risk and provide extra advising for those students. If you have faculty alerts, use them to direct students to tutoring or advising during the semester. And here's an idea for increasing your graduation rate. Have students meet with an advisor before their last year to plan their courses. If they're in a lockstep program where they know what courses they have to take the last year, this may not be necessary. But for many of our students, it's been very helpful, and it's been a big part of why our graduation rate increased so rapidly. In the longer term, review your program admissions criteria and plan to redirect students who are not being successful in their first program that they attempt. Also, have your faculty review the teaching in critical courses. Does the pedagogy need to be improved in order to increase student learning? And, this is a resource issue, increase access to academic advising. Good academic advising can help a lot of students be more successful than they are. I'd like to point you to some resources. My office has compiled a list of reports that we have done, and we keep those on the website opir.fiu.edu/retention-graduation-studies. Look at the list of reports. If there is a report that you think would be of particular interest to you, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I will send you a copy of the report. You can email me at boronatc@fiu.edu. I've also sent a copy of our model for predicting retention of first-year students to the conference organizers in the hope that they can make that available to you. Thank you, and please don't hesitate to email me with any requests or questions.
Very good. I think you can see that the key things that here are, she began with a very critical question that was aimed at their markers of student success, what it was that they were trying to aim toward. They followed a systematic process of interrogating the data. Then they moved forward to identify potential areas in which there were weaknesses or issues, and then proceeded to develop some interventions. And it was a continuous improvement cycle that we could go with. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask Murray Leibbrandt to come forward, and he will talk with us on the next set of materials that are associated with this and provide us with further insight. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, so my job is to try and report back on a fantastic workshop that we had before the first day of the conference, before yesterday, on integrating and building our data for effective student support. That's not the most exciting title you've ever heard, but it was an incredibly exciting engagement, and we started our engagement with the presentation that you've just had. And so my job then is to cope with the rest of the day, but quite liberally. I've taken quite a lot of license. That presentation really did focus hard on what's happening inside of our institutions and using data to improve, enhance students' performance, and get graduation rates up inside. And a lot of our deliberations over the last few days have been about that. But that's not where we started yesterday morning, right? You'll remember we started with a context within, what are we doing as universities in our society? What's our role? And, why do we want to promote student success in our institutions? Because they are very important to us as a country. So I'm supposed to be splicing in this narrative of mine with data. So here's some data. Can we see it at the back? Yeah. Okay. I'm not always a successful educator in that sense. So I'm pleased with myself. Okay, let's see, though, if it makes any sense. This is from what's called the General Household Survey. It's a survey by Statistics South Africa. They undertake it every single year in South Africa, a nationally representative household survey. And it asks a lot of stuff about households. It asks about the services coming into households in particular. It asks a bit about the health of the household. As you can see, it also asks about earnings to members of the household and education levels of members of the household at a certain level of detail that might not satisfy this particular audience, because you can see it asks years of schooling, basically, and then when it gets to the post-secondary environment, it asks about diplomas and certificates and university degrees. But still, let's see what this says to us about what a qualification gives you in our society right now if you're a 25 to 59-year-old South African. So the way we ran the modeling was to look at incremental improvement. How much do you gain? So we start at grade 9. Okay, you have a grade 9, and you're earning a certain amount in the labor market. If you get a grade 10, what happens to your earnings? They go up by 23 percentage points by moving from grade 9 to grade 10. That's big. Probably doesn't surprise people who focus on high school education, because grade 10 is a really important year in the system. If you go from grade 10 to grade 11, you don't get a big premium on that extra year. But if you're going to get to grade 12, you have to get through grade 11, right? There's no way around that. And a complete grade 12 gives you 40 percentage points more than a grade 11. So it gives you, there is a premium to getting matric in our labor market. That's an important message. If you listen to talk radio, what do you hear? You hear people telling the youth, you're wasting your time in school. Right? But at the same time, if you do studies like I do, you do surveys that track youth, they aspire, they give away everything to keep going in school. So the youth are smarter than the people on the talk radio. You need to get to matric. And then, particularly, because you need to get to matric to get to post-matric. So if you get a post-matric diploma or certificate, your earnings go up 66 percentage points compared to a complete matric. That's a massive jump. And then just to complete the story, if you get a university degree, it goes up a further 54 percentage points. This is a very famous finding in the labor economics literature and the education literature, that South Africa has what's called internationally a skills twist, where the returns to schooling have got very high at the top end and have really flattened out a lot elsewhere. So people know they need to get to post-secondary schooling and to university. But those returns, they show that universities seem to be delivering something good to our society, certainly to our labor market. That's productive workforce. But obviously we're in a highly unequal society, one of the most unequal societies that we have anywhere in the world. And so how do the universities fit? We've seen that people get a high return, but who's coming to the universities and going out into the labor market? And that will determine the role that our universities are playing in the production of inequality in our society, if I can put it that way, or to the alleviation of inequality. And so what are the stories that we tell? What does South African data tell us? They're national data. I've got examples later on. I'll skip through them because I'll just explain it in words here. You've got these famous funnels in South Africa that funnel people through to eligibility for university. And by the time you get to eligibility to university, it's a very narrow funnel. And it bears the footprint of apartheid South Africa. So, given, and I'll talk to this a bit, your location, your home background, your education, your pre-university education, we've got quite a peculiar group coming into our university system and getting these high returns. So, the way the system's playing out right now is making our inequality persistent rather than transformative. But we're trying hard. I'm not rapping you over the knuckles. We're trying, I know, we're trying incredibly hard in the salt mines, and this whole conference, in a sense, is directed at doing something about that. So, when one goes to achieving the dream, as I was privileged to do this year, these narratives are told, and Tim told us something about these narratives yesterday morning. They were on the table as this American-type scenario, and Adam Habib said you have to be quite careful about context and stuff, but nonetheless, this is the narrative, and then Georgia State decided that they weren't comfortable with ignoring a whole pocket of their environment and just excluding them from the university and thinking about throughput rates and stuff in isolation to all of that. And they really did something about it. And what was hugely impressive to me at Achieving the Dream is most of the people there are people like us. They work in the salt mines on very specific projects, but they are filled with this passion that they're part of something big. They're part of transforming South Africa. I've now located back here. That's part of transforming America, right? But we are part of transforming South Africa. That's, and it's real to them. And I think it's real to us too. It's been a privilege to share these few days with you, and I think this does motivate us, right? Okay, enough ideological therapy or whatever, but absolutely crucial context to what we're doing, because there's an easy way to increase throughput rates in this country, which is to get really good students that, as I challenge my colleagues, our students are so good it's not clear that we've actually added any value. We might even have damaged them, but they still do really well when they come out on the other side, right? So here's a better title to what we were doing in our session yesterday. Data for Empowering and Transformative Universities. How does that sound? Our students, right? I think, thank you, loyal clappers. I appreciated it. But, we do believe this, right? That it's our students. The theme, and it was said a number of times yesterday, that this is about student-led, student-focused initiatives. Our students are actually the leading edge of a flourishing South Africa. We're not in a particularly good state right now. If you can't understand that, well, I don't know. I'll let that hang. Right. So, what data do we need as a means to the end of students fulfilling this potential and us fulfilling our mission as universities? Okay, now, I'm not going to speak about the progress to university. I'm going to take the first presentation as speaking about that. We did have a wonderful presentation yesterday, though, by Charles Shepherd, and this is just an advertorial. If you can't read it, you're not supposed to. Right? He gave us a wonderful presentation, and we've had it from Di Parker, the other Di, about the DHET data, the HEMIS data, the CHE assessments, and others. And so it's a wonderful resource for us about what's in there and what can be merged with your specific programs that you're running inside the universities. The focus for us is really not inside of the university. It's the two ends of my diagram. So let's start with the pre-university life, what I'm calling pre-university life. So, and here I want to focus on the national, there's tons of national data that's available. And it's a question of, as Jan has said any number of times, what question are you asking? What do you need the data for? It helps us. I won't talk to the details of the slide, but this is also from the General Household Survey. It helps us understand who is getting to tertiary institutions, this idea of this funnel that we're trying to change in this country and transform with many, many initiatives. The national data locate the universities in a broader context. And looking from, even from the department out with our data that pulls university data, can't give you the same perspective. Because it doesn't start from a picture of our country and come back into the universities. So that's what you get out of these data. You know, and we know the story. 51% of South Africans have at least grade 12. I'm just picking two statistics. And then one right at the bottom. That of those who have grade 12 and have exemption, university exemption, they're eligible to go to university, many don't go. So there's lots of useful data in our national surveys. And it tells us who's going to which of our post-secondary institutions. For example, yeah, that's exactly what this table does. For those who have matric, 15 to 24-year-old South Africans in 2014, 75% of those with matric didn't go to any post-secondary institution. 12% went to a public university or a university of technology, 6% enrolled in a public college, 3% went to a private university, and 3% went to a private college. So that's the shape of the system. And there's triangulated data. It's not just from the GHS you can get this from many places. And you can triangulate because you can't, you know, it's not always 100% reliable. Okay. Some of our national surveys can do very special things. They can push on into the realm that Cheryl Delaray was challenging us about. Don't just describe stuff. Don't just use data to describe situations and then tell a very complicated story. Take yourselves seriously enough to actually try and pose a well-posed question and answer it specifically. So if you're interested in what perpetuates the disadvantages of black South Africans in getting to university or getting to post-secondary institutions, there are some data sets that can actually answer that question. And I run something called the National Income Dynamic Study, so there's no way I wasn't going to stand up here and talk about it. It's an amazing study, not because I run it, just because it is. It's a longitudinal study. It tracks South Africans. In 2008, we had a base wave that was nationally representative. We interviewed 28,000 South Africans. We've stayed with those 28,000 South Africans, and we follow them. We interview them every second year to find out what's happened to you over the last 2 years. And you can tell a dynamic story. We've just finished the fourth wave, and it's available on all the waves, available publicly for download. That's a commercial. Okay, commercial over. It tells the story about either people escaping from poverty or getting ahead or not. That's what what it can do. So it can tell us a lot about who's getting through to enrolling in university. In the survey, there's a question about school names. What school did you go to? And what university did you go to? And that enables us to merge the data with data from the department, from the national departments of basic education and the departments of higher education, to bring together the school records so that we can complement our story about the individual, their household, and their community that's in NIDS with their school and the quality of their school. Somebody yesterday made a wonderful point about how do you know whether somebody's done really well on your entrance test without knowing whether they even had a science lab in their school. That's the sort of data that you can get out of the school admin data. So you pull that in the National Income Dynamic Study. I'm not going to go through these, just except to list the type of variables that I'm talking about that are special to NIDS. besides the fact that we follow people over time. For example, there's much more detailed information on household size and composition and household sources of income and mother's education and father's education and your mental well-being, your health in general. We ran a numeracy test, a standardized numeracy test. That's incredibly useful. So this thing called, rather threateningly, numeracy z-score or z-score, that's the results of the test normed to 0. So the mean is 0. Whether people have a schooling history, whether they've repeated grades, the highest grade they took maths, their school fees, and the money they spend on their uniforms, money they spend on transport getting to school or university, etc. These are important things, and on the right-hand side, we won't get time to talk about it, but you can just see that there are already these stark differences. Just look at, for example, the school fees. Those who were in university in NIDS, the fees that they were paying 3,696 Rand on average. When they were in matric, they paid 3,696 Rand on average for their schooling, compared to those with no post-school who paid 610. Okay, these are the schools data that we merged in to NIDS. Percentage of, and then obviously this is then based at the level of the school. What sort of schools were these people in when they got their matric? We know the percentage who wrote the matric exam, who passed of those who wrote maths, what sort of maths, the average maths score. These are all in the Department of Basic Education's databases. English scores, etc. And obviously there's learner-teacher ratios, and there's a whole lot of school infrastructure information in there too. Okay, so what? So then if you do the type of model that people do when you're modeling progress through universities, you run the same sort of model, but it's basically who enrolls in a university or a TVET. And you control for a lot of these rich factors: age, sex, race, matric school characteristics, parental education, household size, and other stuff. And then you can see that these mathematical ability, independent of years of schooling, mathematical ability really counts. Whether you repeated a grade is a strong. You're highly unlikely to enroll in university if you repeated a grade. Your household income is hugely important. Each Rand improves the probability of you going to a university. The household income, and it's the household income at the time that you were making the decision to go to university. One of the clever things in the literature is that these numeracy scores are a very good way of predicting all your previous household circumstances. So the role of income obviously comes in much earlier in terms of what high school you went to or what primary school you went to. These numeracy scores are really soaking up a lot of stuff, so that this income coefficient here is actually at the point of decision making. Okay. I'll just do the university slide. I've got one for universities and TVETs, but I presume you can get the presentation. I'm trying to show three things here. There's incomes. We call them terciles because economists have to be obtuse. Okay? Low income, middle income, and high income. That's terciles. You divide the population into thirds. And then we've got the standardized numeracy score. This line here, so as you go along here, you get a higher score on the maths. This line here is then the high income people. I think this is an incredibly telling statistic. It's way higher than any of the other groups. So these guys here, say it's 0. They're below the mean. They're really not really good students. They're not good candidates to go to university. But they're going. Okay? Compare that to the low-income people. Here's their line. It's very low. The probability of going to university is very low for low scores. Okay, that's fine. That's not unexpected. But even if you get beyond 0, you have to start doing incredibly well. 1 standard deviation above the average score before your probability of going to university is actually correlated with your ability. That's an incredible story, I think. And it shows, like, you know, many of our testing at the front end of universities is about trying to work out who has potential. We're missing lots and lots of South Africans with potential. It's a very strong cautionary note to too exclusive a focus in this fuss debate about the missing middle. There's a missing bottom end that also needs some serious attention in the country. Okay. So, stocktake of data. Who's coming to university? We've got tons of data. Census information is very, very detailed, in particular at local area level. General household survey, there's a community survey that's in the field right now from Statistics South Africa. It's another large, at 350,000 South African households, to give you local area statistics. It'd be incredibly useful to be able to profile communities at that disaggregated level. And then specialist surveys like NIDS, there's a number of youth surveys that are highly germane to what we're about. There's one called the Cape Area Panel Study. I spelt it out in full because I was involved. There are many youth cohort studies as well running right now in the country. That would be very useful to us. So we can learn a lot about who's coming into the higher education system, from where, from what sort of background in general. But as these data stand, they don't really give us information about actual institutions of higher learning. You can tell in NIDS who goes to WITS. But that doesn't mean that's useful information to WITS. It's not a representative sample of people who are coming to WITS. These data are better at telling the national systemic story rather than the specific institutional detail, except for the census, perhaps, as we'll see, if I get time. Jane. Okay, so who's coming to university? Another way of tackling this issue. Obviously, it's come up at this conference a lot, that there's a lot of interventions and information about the schooling system and its failures and its successes and things. Interventions on school choice, maths, science. I'm treating that as in the box of before people come to university. It doesn't mean that they're not important. Let's then focus on what we've done to reach back and find out about who's applying to our institutions and where they're from, which is a different way of posing the question. It's not the systemic question, it's now more detailed information about who's coming to us specifically. There is a need for the university system to understand in general who is coming to universities, and there's a very differentiated university system in South Africa, and it's important to understand that. I list a few what I call systemic initiatives that are underway in the country. One is to link the university database, the HEMIS data, with the Department of Basic Education's information systems, and we discussed that at some length in our workshop. But not particularly constructively, because most of the discussion was moaning about the bad quality of the Department of Basic Education's data. That was what the discussion was about. And it's pretty tragic. because the HEMIS data is audited, it's pretty good data. But you need, and you need to merge by ID number to actually get these learners into their schools so that you follow them through the admin system of education. That's what something. So the quality of the basic education data seems to be poor. That was attested to by many yesterday. I want to flag one thing that came up yesterday, and COAs. I don't really belong in this meeting. I'm a bit of a fraud, right? I'm a poverty and inequality person. So it gives me a great pleasure to come up with an acronym for that's in use in your facilities, but now I've forgotten what it means. What does COAs mean? Something online application. What is it? Thank you. Thank you. So, what is that? What is that? The DHET are centralizing the application system. And that seems to me that's worth thinking about what that will do for systemic initiatives to understand students, where they're coming from, etc. Right? Because if everybody applies to a single place, that's an opportunity not to be lost. Okay. We had a wonderful session led by Michael Henn that then focused on actual interventions that we're running in our universities. And he had this great slide. So I'm using this as an advertorial for getting his presentation too. About, because he was challenging us to find out what we're doing that combines data, not just inside the institution, to actually achieve our objectives, to measure whether we're succeeding in things. So, what he challenged us to do was think of a project that uses multiple data sources and aims to bolster student success. Okay. See, he's got complicated PowerPoint slides. So, I just have to say, I'm just flagging something here, that I'm hugely impressed by what universities are doing to reach back, to understand who is coming into their universities, from where, what's their background. It's been flagged at this gathering. That's crucial. It's crucial to the first year experience, to student success, to students settling down, to students making the right degree choices, etc. What's come up as a key linking variable in the discussions and in a few of the initiatives that were flagged in our workshop is the actual admissions process itself and the data that you gather, and in particular the admissions tests. Almost all South African universities are now, you've got to pitch up and write a test in, say, May of the year before you come to university. And so both in the admissions process and in these admissions tests, there are opportunities to learn much more about who's coming to your institution, especially the things like the admissions tests, because people will write the test but not come. You want as broad a possible picture as possible of who's thinking of coming to your institution. And then some of the initiatives were then to gather, to talk about these tests and what variables you can put in the admissions test that really help you. And I think that surveys like NIDS can be suggestive of the type of variables that you really need to find out to flag. There's a great example of that reaching back in this paper that was presented today from Wits, called Understanding Students as People in the World. I mean, what a cool title to begin, right? But it was really about this enterprise of trying to combine education and schooling data with the HEMA system, with Wits's data, with Wits's admissions data, to really provide a platform to support students from as early on as possible. There's another one. I don't really have time to talk about it. Unfortunately, it is a UCT example, so it pains me. It's about UCT admissions. I will talk about it, but not go through all the slides. It's about the fact that UCT has an admissions policy that is trying to transform the student body of the university. And so there's slightly different admissions requirements for people coming in from different racial groups. There's now a new complicated policy that doesn't want to talk about racial groups, so it talks about everything other than racial groups, but it's the same story. Now, how do you assess the impact of that policy? You've got your own data from the UCT application system. You've got their demographic characteristics, matric performance, home address, whether people were eligible, applied for and got financial aid, and whether they decided to come to the university or not, and whether they graduated, and their ID. So you can describe with these data whether a UCT student body is diversifying. And it's been fairly successful on that front. But the contentious issues around this policy are whether you're giving admission points in the UCT context to black students who don't need any help because they're actually from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds. That's a hard question, right? It's well posed, but it's hard. There's another question about what happens to the many, many white applicants who don't get admission to UCT. I get sort of harangued at any bright place I go to, right? And I'm talking, and somebody has a son who didn't get into UCT even though they got 8 A's, and all of a sudden they want to put me on the braai instead of... Anyway, I'm unapologetic, so, and I don't get invited to any braais anymore. So, but what did we do to answer the question about where the equity outcomes on income? We had to merge back using the household information, the address we had, to census data from where they came. So the census had small area information. We could use some Google Maps. And we could locate them in where they came. So that gives you community characteristics about people. But South Africa, being South Africa, your community tells you a lot. It's not as though there's wild heterogeneity in pockets of rural South Africa. So that, together with the financial aid information, helped us tell quite a complicated story, a nuanced story. We had a decent answer to the question about the income. About what happened to the white people who didn't get in. I'm abusing white people. There were lots of people who didn't get in. But the HEMIS database has everybody who applies to all universities. It was quite possible with the complete support and active support of the department to actually follow those people. They didn't get into UCT. Where did they go? Well, we could answer the question. Here's some preliminary results. So, the policy had substantial impact on the racial composition of who came into UCT. Fine. But we can also say that the policy was well targeted. I've got a technical answer to that question. Let's just accept it was very well targeted. Up to the 80th percentile of African applicants were in line with the 20th percentile of white applicants on income. And then 90% of the impacted white applicants went somewhere else. We can follow them. Sorry. That wasn't I wasn't expressing any emotion there. I was just waving my hands. And most of them graduated. You can follow them through the system. Anyway, so it requires huge cooperation across institutions to do work like that. It's quite hard to do. It requires huge cooperation. And maybe if we had a better centralized system to deal with these issues systemically, well, we could probably make more progress. What about, quickly, how am I doing? I'm out already. Okay, so obviously what's impressive about the conference is the extent of energy going into career guidance, into working with one's students about life after university, after graduation, and making that transition a success. We've had some really excellent presentations on that. There was one this morning on career exploration meets mobile technology. And Georgia State spoke about it yesterday as well. And we had a DHEAD talking about their career guidance initiative. So there's career guidance. But there's also dialogue between universities and the broader world around their curriculum and whether they're teaching the right things. And it's not just about earnings in the labor market. It's about whether you're producing citizens that are empowered to go and do good things. Most young South Africans really want to make a difference. I just want to flag the fact that we follow our alumni. At graduation, you get asked to do a survey when you really don't want to do it, right? You're handing back your gown, there you are standing in the queue, and then they're asking you to fill in information so that they can follow you going forward and ask you for money. And you know, it's crucial information. If universities are going to justify themselves, they need to know what happens to their graduates. But we don't do it well. I'm flagging it. There's a fantastically interesting study called the Western Cape Graduation Destination Study that I truly can't talk about. It follows graduates out of Western Cape universities. 2010 graduates, it tracked them in 2012. And it was fascinating in showing how successful the graduates were in getting employment across the board. There's some variation across the institutions, but they're very high employment probabilities. There's some variation across the actual degree qualifications, but all of them are extremely high. It adds a subtlety to this high return on education that comes from the universities out. But it's very hard to do. The attrition, we only got 20% to 26% of the graduates. Rhodes and Forte have just done a very similar study. They also battled to track their graduates. We don't have information in place when people leave the university to track them. There's some talk about a national initiative of that sort, a national graduation destination study. But these initiatives are very expensive and very risky, and one needs to think hard about, is this worth doing? Let's make sure that we're answering a question that's absolutely crucial to us, rather than just improving our alumni tracking system. Either do them properly or not at all. Okay, so to finish where we started, the broader world out there judges universities by what comes out of the universities. And there's lots of good, that's the graph I showed you at the beginning. There's lots of good information about that, but terribly weak information that's skill specific. The national data, the national environment is not generating the skills information that we need. I listed a few initiatives here, but the point remains that we talk about skills shortages all the time in this country, but we absolutely don't have the data to come to grips with that as a phenomenon. Okay, so we're on a mission. It's crucial. There's different parts to the mission. You're all essential. Thanks.